Welcome everybody to the Policy Committee meeting for January 26, 2022. The meeting will start with a roll call, and I'll just state your name and let me know if you're here. Charles Burdell Williams.
Present.
Zachary Epps.
Present.
Those are the Julie Haywood present. Those are the official members of the Policy Committee. But I also want to acknowledge other board members that are present during this meeting. Mr. Schultz, Dan Schultz, and Leah Mulhern.
Here.
Okay, thank you. And next on the agenda, we have approval of the minutes of December 22nd, 2022 that were sent out prior to the meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Mr. Burdell Williams is first. Do I have a second?
That was Mr. Epps with the first. However, I will follow with the second.
Oh, okay, thank you for that clarification. All
Equally
those
baritone voices now, sorry.
That's okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 Motion carries. The minutes are approved. We'll start with old business, starting with policy 315, bloodborne pathogens. And this is a new policy that's been retitled and a consolidation of the policies 314.1, 414.1, and 514.1. And I'll defer to Mr. Diazio or Ms. Jackson.
Yes, there were no updates since the first reading on this policy or AR.
Okay. So this will go to the February 8th meeting for, before I do that, any board comments on bloodborne pathogens, policy 315 and the AR. I'm moving too fast. Okay, seeing none, with no updates to that policy, then policy 315 will be posted for adoption at the February 8th meeting. Okay. And then next on the agenda is policies 314.1, 414.1, and 514.1, management of HIV, which is being proposed for repeal because of the consolidation of these policies into 315, which is now renamed bloodborne pathogens.
Correct.
Okay. Any board comment regarding the repeal of those three policies? Okay. And I don't see any community, so.
Ms. Haywood,
Yeah,
just
Mr.
one very small, and maybe this is, again, I'd like to just pose it for discussion. So just in my professional experience, the phrase bloodborne is typically written as one word. And so again, just, for the sake of the microbiologist and me, I just wanted to, put out there that although, not an overt concern of mine or maybe of the community, it's just something that, if we can, wherever possible in the document, make as one word, I think that would, again, best exemplify the phrase and the meaning.
I totally respect the experts in the field. So Mr. Diazio, I'm sure we can make that change consistently in policy 315.
Absolutely. And this can still move forward for the final adoption. We'll make those changes before the board meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Burdell Williams, for that change.
No problem.
Next on the agenda is policy 323, use of tobacco and electronic smoking products. This is the 2019 policy, and it's a consolidation of three policies, 323, 423, and 523.
And similarly, no changes to this policy since the last time the committee looked at it last month.
Okay. With that in mind, any board comments to policy 323? Okay, I'm going to take it also out to the community. Any community comments or public comments to this agenda item? Okay. Seeing none, this policy will go forward to the February 8th meeting for adoption. Okay. And with the consolidation of policy 323, 423, and 523, next on the agenda is repeal of policy 423 and 523. Any board comment on the repeal of those two policies? Okay, any community comments? Okay, seeing none, again, this policy will move forward for repeal. These policies will move forward for repeal at the February 8th meeting. Next on the agenda is policy in AR 916, volunteers.
Yes, and no changes to the volunteers policy or AR. There was a question, I think, Mr. Schultz, that you raised last month regarding training. I did regroup with Dr. Smith following the meeting. She was not aware of any formal training that's offered, but what she indicated was that the district would continue to conduct the training that it conducts, which is generally intended to be specific to whatever activity the volunteer is going to be undertaking. So if you're going to be chaperoning an overnight trip, you might get different instructions than if you're coming into a building and going to be monitoring a field day or something like that, that the expectations are communicated on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the responsibilities of the volunteer will entail. That's what I was asked to share back with the group.
Mr. Burdell Williams, do you have any other concerns? Or does that address the concern that you raised the last meeting about training?
Actually, I think I was the one who raised it.
Correct.
Okay. Mr.
Although
Schultz,
I'm not trying to Mr. Williams doesn't.
it was a
No.
brilliant comment from whomever it came from. Mr. Schultz, I do see your hand up. So do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just wanted to note that I appreciate that it was looked into, and if that is indeed kind of what the standard practice is among public school districts, I'm comfortable with that. That's all. I do think there is merit to more generic child safety training among volunteers who are working with children. But like I said, if that is what's standard practice, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Any other board comments on policy in AR 916? Okay, I don't see also any comments or any hands raised by the public. So with that, policy in AR 916 will go forward for adoption at the February 8th meeting as well. Next is on the agenda is policy 604, tax waiver requests.
Yes, and this policy, there was a question by Mr. Cohen prior to the first reading approval of this policy regarding the language about disabled veterans. Upon taking a closer look at that language, what ultimately we decided it was recommended was actually just to take the language about disabled veterans out of the policy, because it's actually not a waiver that the district grants. So it's the exemption for disabled veterans is a county program. Individuals apply to that county program, and if they meet the criteria, the county places their property on a tax exempt list. Neither the township, the school district, or any other governmental entity needs to do anything. So it's actually not really a request to the district for a waiver. The language was in there previously just to try to, the township's fiscal year starts January 1, the school district's fiscal year starts July 1. And so when the county places a parcel on the tax exempt rolls, they generally do so as of January 1st. And so there's always an open question about, well, what do you do with that half of the year of the tax year for the school district? But as we looked into it, it's clear that what's intended by that is whenever the property goes on the tax exempt rolls, the exemption kicks in as of the start of the next fiscal year. So my recommendation in talking with the business office was to actually just remove reference to the veterans program, since the district doesn't really have to do anything. And that takes out the possibility of having incorrect information if the county program changes or anything like that. So that was how we addressed that. Because that was a substantive change to the policy, what I would recommend is that this item go back for a repeat or for a new first read at the upcoming board meeting. And I'm certainly happy to communicate with Mr. Cohen offline if that would be helpful, just to explain to him the change.
I think, Mr. Diazio, that would be helpful to explain that change, change to Mr. Cohen. And then as part of the public meeting, we can, I'll probably defer to you to also share the rationale for removing that language. I see Mr. Bordeaux Williams's hand is up.
Yeah, just a brief question on that. I guess I'm wondering if, as a part of that that county policy or regulation, that do we receive? I mean, is there some form of communication or like like that we would receive if in fact an individual was under or requesting that particular waiver? Because I could see that like being complicated because it is a county level decision.
Sure. So what would happen is the county would generate a notice to the property owner. And if the property owner wanted to approach either the county, the township, or the school district to ask for either a different effective date or perhaps consideration as to taxes prior to the effective date of the exemption, they can always make that request. And then my recommendation would be that that request would be considered under the residential property taxpayers language of 604.
Okay.
And it would be treated just like any other request for a waiver.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. I just like thinking about, when things are not local, how we can kind of like we can miss out on some communication. And I just like specifically sensitive to the issue that was raised by Mr. Cohen as it pertains to disabled veterans, and just considering the, potential difficulties with communicating or whatever, however that may be. And just wanted to make sure that there was something formal out there, but it sounds like there's a prompt from the county, if I'm paraphrasing you correct. Okay.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay, that's all. Thanks, Ed.
Any other board comments to policy 604? Mr. Diaz, I just have a question. So kind of piggybacking on what Mr. Bordeaux Williams's question was, when the county issues their letter, the determination, is there language in there that the applicability of that is for the next fiscal year, or kind of what's the effective date of that determination?
Yes, the effective date goes into the notice. And I believe that it specifically states in there that the exemption takes place for the start of the following fiscal year. And that's generally how all exemptions work, not just for disabled veterans. So if a nonprofit entity purchases a property and they apply for exemption, it would be the same process. Obviously, the criteria for exemption are different, but once it's decided whether or not the property is exempt, the owner would get a notification, and the notification would indicate the effective date of the exemption.
Okay. So for example, if someone received an exemption from the county on February the 1st, again, after the county's fiscal year, after the township's fiscal year, but prior to our fiscal year, would we be looking at that exemption as it relates to July 1?
It would likely, in that case, probably not take place until the following fiscal year, because if a decision came out today, it would probably say that the property was placed on the exempt roll as of the 2023 tax year, since we're in the 2022 year already, and the school district's 2023 tax year is July 1 of 2023 to June 30 of 2024.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other board questions on policy 604? Oh, Mr. Schultz, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Schultz is prompting me to make sure that I look at the committee structure and that Mr. Schultz is still part of this policy this year. Great, perfect.
So yeah,
Love it.
I couldn't leave you all. I don't know. I'd be here either way though. Don't worry.
Thanks.
And
Glad
while
to
we're
have-
on administrative items, Mr. Epps did send me a message. We have one minor correction to the minutes to make. I believe we need to correct the spelling of his name in the minutes. So we will take care of that before, we will take care of that.
Great. Thank you. We'll move on to policy 621, local taxpayers bill of rights.
Yes,
And this is
and
a policy
with
from
this
1990.
one, no
Sorry.
change, I'm sorry. No changes to this one since the last meeting. We did look into Mrs. Haywood's question from last month as to whether this policy would require an AR. And we will be, I spoke with Mr. Linderman, we are recommending an AR. It's in the works right now, and it will be ready for the next meeting. It's on the draft agenda for next month. So the committee will be seeing the AR next month.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr.
I
Epps.
think I read your lips. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's cool. Just a question moving back to 604. I don't know if that deems a substantive change to the policy. Does it go back to first reading, or are we moving to final adoption?
No, for that one, for policy 604, given the modifications that were made, they would be considered to be substantive, and they'll come back to the committee as a new first read in February.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other comments on policy 621? Okay. Then we'll move forward to new business. We're just moving. Policy 00, I think we should start adding maybe 20 more things to the agenda. Policy 006, meetings. And Mr. Diazio, are the changes made to policy 006 and the next one, 903, because of concerns or issues that have been occurring at board meetings? And are any of these legal changes that were warranted?
Yes, so with respect to 006, there's one version that you are seeing that has the entire policy is struck out. And the reason for that is when we went in here to try to make changes, the formatting of the existing 006 was out of whack for some reason. So I recommended just starting clean with a new template to make the changes. So what you're seeing here is a new 006. And what's really good about this version of 006 is all of the legal references are hyperlinked in the document. So and this is a policy where it's helpful to have those legal requirements hyperlinked, because a lot of times when you're trying to figure out how many votes do you need, is this something that you need a majority or 2/3, all the requirements are linked. The main changes that we made to this policy relate to the additions to the agenda, and these changes were designed to comply with the new requirements of the Sunshine Act about not making changes to agendas within 24 hours prior to the meeting. And then if you do make changes, how the board has to act on them. And we saw that play out a few times at the last public board meeting. So this language about additions to the agenda is new. I'm just scrolling through here to see if there was anything additional. Those were the major changes. When we get to 903, I'll talk a little bit more about public comment, because that's the section that relates more to public comment.
comments to policy 006. Mr. Diazio, just a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is related to, there's a listing of actions that require a vote of the board, a majority vote of the full board. And one of them includes item O, which talks about entering into contracts of any kind in an amount that exceeds $100. I'm not sure that's consistent with our other policies for finances. I don't have them memorized, but that seemed to be a really low threshold.
So that $100 language, that's a school code provision. It's an old school code provision that remains in effect. But the way that many school districts handle that is that ultimately the board does approve the list of bills for every payment that goes out. So ultimately, the way I usually interpret that is that any payments made under contracts, the board's going to approve anyway. And there is a separate policy where I believe the superintendent can authorize a contract. Again, the board ultimately has to approve any payment, but if that policy is not cross-referenced, then I will add a cross-reference. That's a good point.
Okay, that would be helpful. And just two other things to point out. Under the quorum provision on the first page, we indicate that the quorum shall consist of 5 board members. And that is true if it's a meeting of the board, the entire board, and any board committee. But for policy, for example, because we are a true committee, meaning that we are not a committee of the full board, do we need to modify the language here? I did see language elsewhere that talked about, I think, committee meetings.
Yeah, so we put down here, a majority of the total membership of a committee shall constitute a quorum, but maybe what we will do is say a quorum shall consist of 5 board members for a meeting of the board, which is correct. And then maybe we'll just add a sentence here about committee meetings. Would that make sense?
I think so, because I was, a little confused when we just talked about a meeting of the board, when committee meetings are also meetings of the board. And my only last question actually was related, and Mr. Schultz, I'll get to you. I saw your hand up as well. Could you explain the difference between a work session and an information session?
Let's see. So a work session would be a public meeting of the board that where there's just no voting. So for example, if the Office of Education wanted to present a proposed new curriculum in science and wanted to, that's obviously something that would have to be presented publicly, and the board wanted to deliberate on it. Now, if it was, you could have an information session if if the administration just wanted to let the board know that they were thinking about a new science curriculum and allow the board members just to ask some questions. But if the board members ever wanted to have a meeting in public and actually deliberate the merits of the curriculum, but not necessarily take a vote on it. Let's say you just wanted to hold a like they call it a work session meeting, where there's quote deliberations, but there's no vote. That's technically what would be constituted as a work session. Some districts utilize them much more frequently than others. It's not a routine practice in Cheltenham, but we just leave it in here so that the authority is there if the board ever wanted to do that. But it's essentially a legislative board meeting just without a vote.
Okay. It does say an open meeting to vote on or to discuss issues.
Yeah, I see that. Trying to think if there's any, I'll go back and take a look at that after, because my understanding was work sessions were generally non-voting meetings. I guess the board could vote. It's not necessarily a legislative board meeting, or sometimes where I have seen these meetings before is where it's not a board meeting in the sense that you're not going through your entire agenda, but maybe the board would meet just for one specific topic. But let me go back in between the first reading and the second reading here, and maybe just try to tease that section out a little bit. I think you raised good questions, and maybe we need to be a little bit more clear on what those meetings are.
Okay, and where would a board retreat fit in? Would that be an information session?
It technically doesn't it doesn't apply as anything because it's actually not a meeting of the board in the context of the Sunshine Act. So yes, it generally would be, if we were going to put it anywhere, it would generally be an information session.
And so I'm suggesting that we may, since we do have board retreats,
Yep.
And to be fully transparent to the community, we may want to reference a board retreats as part of information sessions.
Okay.
Mr. Schultz?
Thank you. I have some questions that Mr. Diazio, if they don't belong in this policy, please say the word. They are follow-ups on an email I had sent last month regarding, I guess, two different things. One was the format of presentations that are published after the meetings. I know we have gotten very good about making sure they are PDF, but I would like to see a kind of, if it's possible, an allusion or I don't know if requirement is too strong a word, but basically that we don't want to be having our presentations as PowerPoints because many members of the community aren't able to open those, but PDFs are accessible. So that's my first question. Would this be the right policy or administrative regulation to have a reference to that?
I think the argument can be made that it fits in this policy. We can look at language. We can look to add language. I think this might be, I know there was a question about, I knew Mr. Schultz, you had asked previously about the presentations, and then also I know you had some questions about recordings. So I think they can be, let's talk about them. And I think we probably can include language in 006.
Great. The other, oh yeah.
Tease that out a little bit in terms of that request, so that we don't really tie ourselves into having to go back and modify this policy specifically to the format that's presented. We may want to add language that's more general, that says the presentations will be provided in a format that's accessible to the public, so that if it changes, we don't have to go back and change the policy specifically.
And there was an email. In that email, there was a conversation I had with some people I work with who are in the field of sort of like open source software and thinking about open formats. And it's not trivial language, and there might not be any perfect language, but even language that alludes to just, hey, we want these to be generally people can open them without requiring proprietary software to do so. You know, that something along those lines. So I do have another question, but I see Mr. Epps. I don't know.
No, go ahead, Mr. Schultz.
My other question is related to, and yes, Mr. Diazio, the language around recordings would be wonderful to explore. I know we have something in here, but insofar as we would like to have recordings made available, I think that's great. But I also wanted to ask about public participation virtually in our meetings. So in particular, eventually, we'll, I'm sure, move back to having meetings in person. And when we do, I think there has been vocalized interest in trying to make sure that members of the community could still participate and not just view, but also participate potentially via Zoom and remotely in the same way they're able to today, because it's very convenient. And we've seen a lot of additional community feedback from that. So would this be the policy for that discussion? And then second, do you think we would be able to have that discussion?
I'm just taking a look at your policy 007 here, which relates to remote attendance and remote participation, because I want to see if we put anything in here. So we say in here that if there's going to be a board meeting that's conducted primarily or entirely via remote means, then we have to work to ensure Sunshine Act compliance. But what I hear you saying, Mr. Schultz, is something a little bit different. It's once the board returns to in-person meetings, is there a way to support virtual public participation? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That is, yes.
Yeah, so I think there are school districts that are having those conversations, and whether they can support that and whether it makes sense to support it for committee meetings or for regular board meetings or both. What I would say is I think we should probably offline have a conversation with the folks in tech to see what their recommendation might be. And then maybe we could bring that back to the next meeting. Because I don't want to say anything that then maybe the technology folks may say, well, that might not work, or that might not work until we do X, Y, Z. So I'd just like to get a little bit more information. But I think your instinct is correct that it could be in 006 here.
Thank you. And to be clear, my understanding is it would absolutely involve an investment in technology that we don't have. So it would likely need to be something that was deemed a priority by the board, but I wanted to raise that question here. So I totally appreciate and understand that the next step would be to learn about feasibility and understand what it would cost, both in actual hardware and effort. But then from there, maybe we would be able to, I don't know if it would be this committee has the discussion, or if it would need to be a broader board conversation, or if it should be a budget conversation. But I wanted
maybe all of the above, depending on what Mr. Diazio's discussion is with the tech department.
So I'll work with Dr. Scriven offline, and we'll bring tech in as appropriate. And then what probably makes sense will be for Dr. Scriven to make a recommendation after talking with me about any type of legal implications, and his team as opposed, with respect to operational implications.
As one board member, I do support that. I mean, I think we had conversations about it amongst the board as we were leaning into, the decision point around how to navigate our own hybrid legislative board meeting experience. And we realized, yes, there are, some technology limitations, but at that time and now, I definitely support, ensuring that we kind of approach this looking for an opportunity to continue to gain the public access, or provide the public access, that we have provided to them for this amount of time. I would hate to want to, pull that back.
So procedurally, can I just ask a question, Mr. Diazio, in terms of 007? So we would proceed with policy 006 meetings while we pursue the responses to the questions that were raised this evening regarding public remote attendance at our meetings going forward. And then we would bring policy 007, to the extent that it's feasible, back to the policy committee for review. And we could also cross-reference, even in this policy 006, policy 007, even as that evolves, knowing that that's where the remote attendance language will reside.
Correct. Yeah, I agree with the cross-reference. Yep.
Okay. Mr. Schultz, did you have any other questions?
only to note that, and please correct me, but my understanding of 007, at least as described in the purpose, is that it really is around board participation in remote attendance and participation at board meetings by board members. So I just wanted to mention that in case it does belong in 006.
So you're correct, Mr. Schultz, as to the current scope of 007. I think what could happen, what I was thinking when Ms. Haywood was making her comment, was that we might perhaps, when we look at 007, either modify the scope slightly or add a paragraph to the 007. I agree, it doesn't just fit cleanly in there right now, but with some revisions, I think we'll have to see what's being proposed to see if it goes in 006 or 007. But procedurally, Ms. Haywood, you're correct in terms of if we ultimately found that 007 needed to be revised, that would be the process for doing it.
And I think, Mr. Schultz, we do have a little bit of time. This is only a first read. So we'll have another month to bring this back to the board. So in the meantime, we can maybe see if in fact we either need to modify 007 or cross-reference it in 006 or add very specific language in 006 to address remote attendance by the public.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great questions. Thank you. Mr. Epps?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To what extent would the board need policy around meetings that the board is organizing or sponsoring that is not like an official voting meeting? For example, there was a legislative town hall last year, events where obviously there would be a quorum, there's topics, it's organized by the board. So to what extent would there need to be policies around those types of meetings?
So as long as they're not prearranged gatherings of the board for the purposes of deliberating, I think the board can always, and the district can always offer events and opportunities, whether they be through meet and greets, through town halls, or any other type of activities. There's no real legal requirements on them other than that a quorum of the board can't be deliberating official action. But that exists, whether you're at a town hall or whether you're just, at a social function as a group. So I don't see a need for policy around that topic because there's not a whole lot of law that would apply. But if I'd be interested in hearing more if there's a strong feeling otherwise.
Not a strong feeling that we need it was really, and it seems like all of these, appreciate the hyperlinks as well. All of these have a direct link to what is legally required of the
Correct.
board.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that your answer sufficed. Appreciate that.
Great question, Mr. Epps. Any other board questions on policy 006?
And what I might suggest with 006 is that we'll make these changes because I know we have to add some cross references. We're going to add some quorum language, look at the work session language, work in some language about accessibility of presentations. So we'll do all of that in advance of the first reading, and either myself or Ms. Jackson can send an email out to the committee letting you know that the changes have been made. Because then if you're okay with them, the policy with the revisions in it can still proceed to a first reading. It's almost as if we're making the changes in real time now, but we'll let the committee put eyes on it before it goes for first reading.
And then I think procedurally, if there are other material changes that we need to make to 006 between the first read and the second read, or really the board adoption, as it relates to 007, we might need to bring this back for a new first read.
Correct. Correct.
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Next on the agenda is policy 903, public participation in board meetings.
Yes, so this policy was starting to get to the point where it was old. It was last revised in 2013, but then there's also been some, court direction on public comment. There was a recent decision involving the Pennsbury School District in Bucks County. And so we modified 903 to be consistent with the precedent that those decisions are, the outcome of that litigation. What we're really seeing is that absent a threat, absent disorderly behavior that prevents the board from doing its work, individuals who are providing public comment have a lot of leeway under the First Amendment to be very critical, to be very disparaging, to be very what some people may call offensive and inappropriate, but that is protected speech. And so the board, you'll see that a lot of language in here that talked about the presiding officer being able to interrupt a statement if it's irrelevant or abusive or personally directed. All of that stuff, the court was very clear that those terms were, from a constitutional law standpoint, they were too vague, they were overbroad, and that they couldn't be supported. What we were able to leave in here, and the language that's still in here, is if someone comes to the podium and the statement is not related to the board's business or matters that may come before the board, obviously you can ask them not to talk about that. Obviously the comment has to be related to the board's business. If the language is not otherwise protected by the First Amendment, if there's threats or things like that, that's not protected speech. You could stop that. The one thing that is still in here that I think I want to have a little bit more discussion about is the word obscene. The Pennsbury litigation was very clear that the individuals challenging Pennsbury's policy were not challenging the word obscene. They challenged irrelevant, they challenged personally directed, they challenged abusive, but obscene was not challenged. And the court specifically said, we're not going to address obscene because it wasn't raised. My sense is that the word obscene, if it were challenged, would probably be held to also be vague and overbroad. And what I'm seeing with more of our clients is they're actually proactively taking the word obscene out, and they're just leaving this catch-all phrase about speech which is not otherwise protected by the First Amendment. And so in order to avoid the possibility of having to bring this policy back once either the Pennsbury litigation concludes or another litigation, I actually would recommend striking the word obscene from the policy. That's sort of a new recommendation that I'm bringing up in real time here to the board, but that's something that I would ask the board to consider. The other thing that the board can do is you can also impose a reasonable time limit, and the board uses 4 minutes. That timeline can also be up for discussion. Most school districts utilize a 3 or 4 minute timeline. I'm aware of a few school districts that use 2 and a few that use 5, but the overwhelming majority use 3 or 4. So you're right in line there at 4.
Thank you, Mr. Diazio, for that background information. I think it's really helpful to look at the context of the changes.
Yep.
And again, as Dr. Scriven pointed out, this is a policy from 2003, which obviously has now been updated to address, again, some of the more current litigation. Any board comments on policy 903 in terms of deleting the word obscene, the duration, the 4-minute duration for public comment? Okay, I saw Mr. Burdell Williams' hand up first, and then Mr. Schultz.
I'm going to respectfully hand over to Mr. Schultz, who I did recognize hand was up first. He's waving me off. We said we weren't. We did this all of 2021, and we're starting 2022, and we're not doing it. Okay, Dan, got it.
I didn't look that far up on the tile of the.
I talked a lot last time. I want somebody else. You're probably going to say what I was going to say. So
no, maybe.
Charles, you're on mute.
Yep, I hit mute and unmute like twice there. Sorry. I guess when it comes to like removing obscene, right? For me, I guess I don't have a strong opinion as one board member. To be straightforward, striking the other examples of languages, personally directed, abusive, like obscene to me is a relative. I think when compared to those phrases, so I don't, again, I don't have a strong opinion, but I'd say I wouldn't mind it not existing. But again, if the majority of the committee here or any other board members believe strongly or otherwise, then And I'm okay with that. My second comment was about the duration of our comment period. For the longest amount of time, I thought that it was 3 minutes. Like right now and to this very moment, I thought that it was 3 minutes. And and I remember now that it was not. It was more than that. So I'm okay with 4 minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
Mr. Schultz.
I had slightly different things to say, but so first I'll actually go in reverse order. We're currently at 5 minutes. Is that correct?
Oh, is it 5? Okay.
I believe so. And I personally would advocate for keeping it what it is, unless we have a reason to want it to be 4. Rarely do members of the public utilize all 5, but when they do, they're usually coming in with passion and intent, and maybe that extra minute is the minute that will help them feel more heard. So for what it's worth, I would be, unless we want to change it, I would default to 5 myself.
Is there any other recommendation to, or any recommendation to change the current duration from 5 to 4? Because we do currently have 5. I concur with Mr. Schultz's observation about the 5.
Okay. I
Um,
apologize for that. I'm not sure where I picked up the 4, so I will make that change.
Sounds good.
And one other thing, while I make that change, I forgot to point out in the opening, one of the other things we learned from the Pennsbury decision was that a lot of times, many school districts before were requiring individuals to state their name and their address where they reside. The court sort of said that stating your full address, that there could be some invasion of, some privacy, safety issues with your full address. So we changed that here to say, and the area of the township in which you reside. So Glenside or Wyncote or Cheltenham, it's fine to require that, but that the court sort of said that requiring someone to state that they live at 500 Main Street in Wyncote was asking too much for purposes of the public meeting. So that language was changed.
okay. Mr. Schultz, did you have any other comments?
Yeah, I wanted to understand what, if somebody were to use a racial slur in a public forum, if we remove the word, I mean, that would be obscene, but what would we be, that is protected speech, I believe. Yes. But obviously that's harmful to our school community in tangible ways. What would we be able to pull the mic?
So we've looked at this. A lot of it is very context specific. What some districts will do, if ultimately we look at it from a legal lens and say, as offensive and horrible as this is, it probably is protected speech. Sometimes what school entities have done is they've added a disclaimer to the video to say, like, we're broadcasting this because this is what the law requires us to do, but we just want viewers to be very clear that, there's very distressing language in here, and the board does not, encourage this. The board does not support this. I suppose there could be times where it crosses the line and it's not protected speech, but I think First Amendment protections are pretty strong. And as a governmental entity, in order to cut someone's First Amendment rights off, it's a rare circumstance where you can do that. Now, what's unfortunate is that in the Pennsbury case, a lot of times in the legal community, we say bad facts make bad law. And unfortunately, what was cut off in the Pennsbury case was speech that was very, very clearly protected. And as a result of that, the preliminary decision from the court was very strong in saying the school district really overstepped there and did something that it was not supposed to do. And by the way, all of these terms that are in your policy about abusive and personally directed, they are all constitutionally too vague and overbroad. But what I would say is we from time to time are called upon to look at what a community member says in a meeting. And if we're able to edit it out for any number of reasons, we can. If there's a privacy interest on the part of an individual citizen or student, sometimes we're able to remove it. If ultimately we're not able to, sometimes a disclaimer statement is the best that can be done.
Okay, thank you. Is the language we have around, restricting speech in the school building, there's some language, I forget what the language is, but that's similarly protected by the First Amendment, correct?
In our civility policy, which we'll look at in a moment, the civility policy goes further, and we're able to go further in the civility policy because we clarified that the civility policy doesn't apply with respect to public comment at board meetings. Where you have real First Amendment rights as a citizen is when you're speaking in a forum such as public comment at a board meeting. Nobody has a constitutionally protected right to come in and be disrespectful in a school building or in a parent-teacher meeting or at a soccer game that takes place on school property after school. The protections attached at public meetings because you're speaking in a limited open forum, which has First Amendment implications. So our civility policy is able to be a little bit stronger. And certainly if we had a community member or any visitor to our schools that was engaging in inappropriate behavior, even if it would be protected speech at a public meeting during public comment, we can impose restrictions and consequences in scenarios that are not board meetings.
Got it. And I appreciate it. And this, I think the policy I was thinking of actually was student expression, where we have language around actually off-campus after-hours speech. And the language is, you are not off, we are regulating off-campus speech for students for things that do or is likely to materially or substantially interfere with the educational process, interferes with another's rights.
Sure.
All right, well, this is, I appreciate this conversation. There's a lot to think through because on one hand, we want to be within the law, and B, we want to support free speech. But on the other, there is a disproportionate power dynamic in certain types of speech, I think, that can be, we become a vector for a platform for things that could actually disrupt our operations as a school district and impact students' education. So that's where the other example is if somebody were to be sharing information about a minor that is not appropriate to share, but I don't know if it would, like an address of where a student lives or medical information about a student, or if a faculty member starts talking about a student's grades because they're allowed to make comments in public comment, what are our limitations there? Is there?
Generally, if a community member or anyone else is speaking about an employee or a student in a way that it's school officials can't disclose information about other students. It's a little bit, FERPA doesn't apply, and the confidentiality of student records and student information doesn't really apply to community members. However, again, in the one-off chance that happens, and I've seen it happen once or twice in doing this type of work, what generally happens is that on the back end after the meeting, you look at what was said and you try to figure out, is there a basis to pull that back, whether it's on a privacy right ground or Sometimes you do it on the basis that not doing so would, impose potential legal liability on the district. So there's ways to look at it, but there's not a great way to write it in a way that is so narrowly tailored that we don't run the risk of getting challenged. Any way I would write it, there would be an argument that it was written too broadly. So we try to look at those scenarios on a case-by-case basis. And frankly, many times where this has happened, if a community member comes to public comment and starts talking about another student, when you remind them that this meeting was recorded and it's going to be rebroadcast, sometimes they'll actually, upon further reflection, think, I probably shouldn't have done that. And with agreement of the speaker, you can then redact that content. And you'd be surprised that when someone has an opportunity to reflect and the emotions subside from whatever they're very impassioned about at the meeting, you'd be surprised many times people will say, maybe that was a little bit too much. Maybe I said a little bit too much there. Yeah, that's not a good look for me to have this speech out there. I'm okay to pull that back.
Thank you. These are all clear answers, and I may think of more for next month, but
sure.
It's an
remember, this is still just a first read policy.
We kept this agenda pretty light because we knew that these couple policies were going to generate a lot of discussion, because they're generating a lot of discussion everywhere. So that's why there's only a few items on new business.
So, Mr. Diaz, I have a couple of comments
Sure.
on this policy. So when we look at the guidelines, we talk about requiring public participants to be residents, taxpayers, or employees of the district. Do those employees have to be residents of the district as well, or just employees of the district, regardless of where they reside?
So the language under the law is residents or taxpayers of the district. The Cheltenham has previously, via policy, extended that right to speak at board meetings to employees of the district, regardless of where they reside. There's no requirement that you do that. So that is something that if you wanted to pull back on, you could. But in the prior policy, employees were listed. Sometimes what I've seen school districts do is they will say that the union presidents are authorized to speak on behalf of their members. That's a different way of doing it, so that it doesn't open it up to every single employee, but matters of importance to the bargaining unit as a whole. But that's certainly for the committee to discuss. You can leave that in there, take it out, or modify it.
Yeah, my feeling would be to keep it as employees of the district. We very rarely have employees attending our meetings, and when they do, they typically are speaking as a collective, on a particular issue. But what I would just say is that second sentence where we ask the participants to state their name and the area of the township in which they reside may not be applicable to an employee of the school district. So we might need to modify that accordingly.
Yep.
And my feeling in terms of removing or not removing the word obscene, my preference would be to remove it. And the reason why is not to say that there won't be instances where people may say something that we may consider to be obscene. That's really a legal construct that is very difficult to apply.
Correct.
And if you even look at the Supreme Court decisions on, obscenity, what did Justice Breyer say? You know it when you see it, and, who knows it when they see it? So I would say that's too ambiguous and too general to include that language, which ultimately has a legal interpretation around it.
Okay.
And I think it otherwise is addressed if it's not otherwise protected by the First Amendment. Any other board comments? Any comments from the public? Okay. This was a really good discussion on this policy. And right now, I guess there are a couple of minor changes, but I don't think anything that would warrant it not going forward as a first read.
Correct.
Okay. All right, the next on the agenda is policy in AR 922 civility, and I think Mr. Schultz, this may address some of your concerns that you raised regarding policy 903.
Yes, so you'll see in the policy here, we simply added a clarifying statement that this policy doesn't apply to public comment at public meetings of the board or committee meetings. Frankly, it doesn't say that the policy doesn't apply at public meetings of the board. It still applies except when you're speaking at public comment. So I don't want anybody to think that this policy can apply to just members of the audience or things like that at the meetings. And that was really done because this civility policy clearly regulates speech and conduct that the board would not have the ability to regulate at the public comment section of the meeting. So for example, if you have a parent who is in a meeting with a teacher and they're very frustrated with the teacher and they're saying, you know, you're not a good teacher, or you know, you're doing this wrong and this wrong, and you're not doing anything right. A building principal could step in and say, look, I know you have a lot of concerns here. I'm going to ask that moving forward, you filter all of your communication through me as the building principal, and then I will work with the teacher to respond. But you can't prevent somebody at public comment necessarily from saying that someone is not a good, you know, superintendent, director of you know, whatever, like a public employee. It's just, that's protected speech, but there's no reason why in a school environment you have to permit that. So that's the context of that change. I think that was the only change to the policy. And on the regulation, just removing unnecessary language here. So just a minor change. This policy was last looked at in the fall of 2019, so it's not that old.
Okay. I see, Mr. Epps, your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. Related to this policy, I did sit me on a journey of other policies, and so I saw the ones that were referenced at the bottom, and then, but to kind of preface my question, I began to wonder where there might be explicit mention of race-based discrimination, bullying instances in terms of, and saw something, and so wondering, long story short, wondering where there might be explicit mention of what happens in that situation in terms of either reporting or addressing those acts.
So our general rule here is that all individuals are treated with courtesy, respect, dignity, kindness. Obviously, any bullying, racial slurs, anything like that would clearly violate that language. There in the AR here, there are some strategies for trying to address that. And then, but if it can't be handled informally, then there's a more formal complaint and resolution process here, which is really outlined in 906, which is the public complaints policy. And that policy basically takes a complaint through successive levels of review. So it'll start with the people most directly involved, and then it might go to a lower level administrator, then it might go to a more senior administrator, and ultimately to the board if the problem's not rectified. So there's both an informal and a more formal resolution process. Also with instances where there's violations of the civility policy, what many times happens is that there are restrictions put on the offender's ability to just interact and communicate in ways that were inappropriate. So for example, if you have a parent board a school bus and berate a child on the school bus, we might impose a restriction that parent not be permitted to board a school bus. And we tell them that if they board a school bus again without permission of the driver, that they'll be considered trespassing, and that will be, referred to authorities. If it happens in a school, sometimes we can say that, you know, you're gonna be escorted around the building by an administrator when you come to the building, or you're only going to meet in a designated area of the building. Or so those are the ways that we kind of handle that. But anything that can't be handled informally or collaboratively, we try to push towards policy 906, which is the complaints policy.
I appreciate that explanation. And that was on my journey, and I even got to hazing and employee discrimination, right? And so to be particular, looking for that explicit mention of, and to even share where this might be coming from, I recall some resources through the Education Law Center in terms of what school boards might do to like explicitly name it in policies. And so I appreciate certainly the inclusion of, you know, all students, right? That's where it starts. But was really looking for like actual steps, like this is what would happen in a, you know, similar to how it's listed out in general, but it's really explicit to that type of, you know, discrimination or even bullying, because I'm thinking of it from the student's perspective, really, yeah, and from a student's perspective. And so my question was answered. I don't think there's that explicit mention. And so I appreciate that.
And there is, and I'm going to try to find it here, there's an equal opportunity and non-discrimination in school practices policy. That's 103. This relates to any type of discrimination, and the language is right here, on the basis of any of these protected classes, which includes race. And in the employment context, 104 would be the policy, which is non-discrimination in employment and contract practices, similarly protects against discrimination on the basis of, again, all of these protected classes. Mm-hmm. And there are complaint procedures outlined in each of 103 and 104. So in 103, if the complaint relates to Title IX, mm-hmm. Ms. Jackson is the Title IX coordinator. We will want to update this as I'm looking at this, because Mr. Blackwell was the assistant Title IX coordinator. If it's not Title IX, though, there's general complaint procedures here. What the reporting is, what the investigation looks like, what a report looks like if there's an investigation report, and then what the district does. That same type of process applies here in 104, with Ms. Jackson being the Title IX coordinator, and then a process for investigating complaints here that are other than Title IX. So 103 and 104 may also be related to your inquiry, Mr. Epps.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I guess really great observation, Mr. Epps and Mr. Diazio, in light of the fact that we have very specific policies, non-discrimination policies, as it relates to their different sectors, would that be appropriate to cross-reference as part of the civility? I mean, I know that those are much more explicit and legally required.
Yep. So I think the answer is probably yes. We did include language here that says, depending on the specific circumstances and allegations, the superintendent or designee may direct that the complaint be handled through a different process. And we put in here discrimination, harassment, and things like that. Because if someone does come forward and files a claim of race or gender or age-based discrimination, and they file it under policy 906, which is the general complaints policy, many times we will point them to the more appropriate policy where that complaint should be handled. Same thing if someone's alleging hazing or bullying or things like that. So that's the reason for that language, but we could try to go through and add cross-references to the other policies that have specific reporting procedures in them.
Mr. Epps, would that address your concern?
Yeah, so that you know, that specific language is what led me down that journey to say, okay, well, are those other procedures actually
Sure.
outlined somewhere? And so yes, it does satisfy my interest for that.
And could and I don't know whether we standardly do this or not, when we cross-reference a policy, we do it by number. And, we generally are fairly facile and be able to find what that policy is. Does it make sense going forward to at least name the policy as well?
We can, yeah, that's not hard to do. So I can do that pretty easily.
I think it just would be easier for both the board and the community to be able to not only have the cross-reference to the numbered policy, but at least the title of the
Sure.
policy.
Yep. Can do that.
Okay. Any other board comment to policy in AR 922? Okay, then subject to those additional cross-references to other policies, this will also go forward for first read at the February 8th meeting. And last on the agenda is policy in AR 823, energy management and sustainability.
Yes, so we put this policy on, it was looked at, I want to say it was looked at back in like 2019, it was, or 18, it was right at the end of Dr. Bobby's tenure with the district. Then we looked at it again in 2021 and got some student input at the time. But it was clear at the time that we didn't have, there was a thought by a number of committee members at the time that they would like for the policy to have said more than it says, but no one was really able on either the board, the administrative, legal, student, nobody was really able to formulate what language they were exactly looking for. So at the time, the board had said, well, let's put a date in this policy and say that before a certain date and time, we'll have a sustainability plan, and then let's look at that plan and bring this policy back. That date that the board put in here was June 30th of this year. That was before the strategic planning got pushed back and before you had a superintendent transition. So given that there are a number of other items that the board has asked from Dr. Scriven in this first year, and in light of committee leadership's recommendation to put this item on the agenda, I thought that it would be helpful to have a discussion about the date. There's no other revisions proposed. This was more of a discussion item for the board at this point.
Okay, I'm just going to open this up for both board discussion and also input from Dr. Scriven. I think those are really valid points, Mr. Diazio, that were not in place a year ago when we talked about this. So Mr. Burdell-Williams?
Yeah, add to that a new director of facilities as well, right? So I think that is an additional layer of complexity in the conversation. I think is one of the stronger supportive voices of the board's adoption of our sustainability resolution last year. That I did want to take more time to add more substance, and I'm still sort of at a loss, but I do agree that with input from the superintendent, recognizing that we've just set some goals out there, and I don't think this one was one of them, that I would just want to also recommend that we talk through a different date. I'm okay with that date. I just don't want us to be again, shuffling priorities in a policy without them being a SMART goal that we're tracking for the success of the superintendent. And I just want to, I know that the sustainability resolution that we adopted didn't have very much in terms of dates either. And I think we agreed at that point, at least in the policy committee meeting, that this date would almost supersede the fact that we don't have one or have any dates actually formally listed in the resolution. And I think we discussed wanting to have that somewhere. So I think that a date is necessary. I do want to talk through feasibility of the sustainability plan, as it pertains to some of the other district goals. I think it's important. I think we need to, have this plan. I think we need to establish a date. I don't know what's within reason, but I'm very much so open, Dr. Scriven, to your thoughts on the matter as well.
Dr. Scriven, I don't know if you're on.
You might be.
Yeah,
Oh,
Dr. Scriven, you are on. Would you like to comment on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Very good. So I see Mr. Schultz has his hand up. I'd rather get the board comments out the way first, and then I'll respond.
Okay, Mr. Burdell Williams, did you have anything else?
No, but I do, again, just recognize the importance of reviewing this policy to add more substance that I think aligns with some of the specifics that we talked about in the resolution. I think that I know that from my perspective as one board member, I was really also looking forward to more student input on this. Right at this point in the year of 2021, we did have the students form their own sustainability committee inside of the high school. And there was a huge amount of outreach happening from an education perspective and also an engagement perspective. And so I would also, again, want to, again, seek some additional input from a student group, which I'm not sure has been reestablished, or if we know who the new membership is, prior to moving forward with, the adoption of any new language here.
Okay, Mr. Schultz. Thank you, Mr. Burdell Williams.
Sure.
Yeah, I really appreciate this being discussed, and I recognize that the date kind of forces this discussion. So I would second, if we do modify the date, I would also like to see it included, even if it's not technically the appropriate way to specify goals through policy. I think this is a unique enough issue that will never be, our business is educating students, and our business is, that's our business, keeping our students safe and educating them. But sustainability has to be, nobody's business is primarily sustainability and environmentalism. So we need to reflect it somehow. To that point, my concern is, we have to be realistic. We have to give Dr. Scriven and administration room to be successful. I also, though, recognize that this is a discussion we've been having for several, I want to say, years. And it's throughout that time, it has consistently been we're not ready to do it. We need to push it. So my concern is that if let's say we moved it to June 30th, 2023, will we be in a similar situation a year from now where we haven't made that progress? Or would it be possible to somehow, make progress, even if the goal isn't to have a sustainability plan by June 30th, but we're still going to have sustainability be a part of when we pass the strategic plan, or some, I don't have a solution, because I truly recognize that we need to be have to be reasonable and recognize that policy is not the place to specify goals. We just passed goals. Sustainability was not one of those goals because it couldn't be. So that I too am very interested in, to Dr. Scriven, what you think might be a realistic. I think you understand the different pieces at play here, and if you think there is a way to get where we want to go at some point, I would love to know what that date would be that's realistic. I also just want to add that, for context, this is something that a lot of students, definitely there's a lot of board passion around this, but most importantly, there's a lot of student passion around sustainability and environmental awareness, and making sure that the space that they are existing in is going to promote a world that they can live in 50 years. So it is important that we keep this on our radar.
So Madam Chair, I see there's one more hand with Zachary. I'd
Can-
just like to hear all of the comments. So
Great. So Mr. Epps?
And my point is unrelated to this. And so if Dr. Scrivener, you wanted to respond to that, my question is more for about the policy and probably for Mr. Diazio.
okay.
So I can yield my time or.
No, and
So
that's fine. And I see Madam Chair has her hand up as well. So
yeah, so Mr. Epps, I'll just raise an issue and then can we circle back to your concern about the policy?
Totally.
Okay. So what I would offer is that I too agree that we need to obviously put a sustainability plan in place at some point. I think at some point, we assumed that we would have for ourselves even a better sense of what we wanted. I don't think we've had those real discussions. We haven't had those discussions either with the students, we haven't, or haven't heard exactly everything that they're thinking. Nor is the sustainability plan part of Dr. Scriven's goals for 2022. What I would want to offer to the committee are two kind of paths we could go down. We could modify this policy that the board establishes a goal of establishing a timeline, a reasonable timeline of adopting a sustainability plan within certain period of time. Or we take this back to the facilities committee where it started as a resolution that kind of bumped up from a energy management policy to a sustainability resolution to this particular AR. And maybe that is also an additional discussion that needs to be had by the full board so that we can have some more realistic timelines as well as discussion materially about what would be contained in a sustainability plan, the cost, the resources that are needed. So I just offer those two paths as additional paths for consideration by the committee as we go forward. But I'd like to hear from Dr. Scriven as well.
yeah, so Madam Chair, I really appreciate that perspective. I would also agree, having reviewed this, this is very high level and very general in terms of this purpose. For me to have clear marching orders, I would appreciate whatever process we collaboratively establish, an opportunity to really hone in more succinctly on what the actual ask or end goals are of this initiative. You can go a million different places with trying to put together a sustainability plan. I've actually been part of that in my prior system. We have a very robust sustainability plan that I'm more than willing to share to give you some perspective on how detailed this actually can be. So I think there's some homework that really needs to happen before I even move forward. And I'm willing that maybe we just like we did with the climate goal, come up with a goal around this that is a higher level around what some of our next steps will be in terms of gathering information in preparation for the development of a plan. So Mr. Charles Bedell Williams, not to have wanted to put you off or anyone on the board. I just wanted to hear all of the comments because I kind of knew where I was in my head and my space. So I would propose that to you and warrant or would be very receptive to any feedback at this point around what I've proposed.
So I'm going to throw it back out to the board committee, and I'm going to start with Mr. Epps because I know you had some specific comments about the policy. But do you have any response or reaction to what Dr. Scriven just shared?
Yep, appreciate that, and that is reasonable in my perspective to consider. And I believe Mr. Schultz alluded to this earlier, but in the next 5 months, like thinking through how to incorporate this into the larger strategic plan, to give this its due diligence. I do even recall as part of my onboarding, there's talk about a sustainability committee at the board level. And so all of that, to do all of that and give it its due diligence, I would support a higher level, if it's included, a higher level goal as part of the next 5 months, and certainly more intention beyond that time frame.
And so, Mr. Epps, just to tease it out a little bit, in terms of language in this policy itself, would you be comfortable in the board establishing a timeline within the next 5 months that would walk us towards a sustainability plan? And Mr. Schultz, I don't know if, and Mr. Bordeaux Williams, if that would meet your, because there's a lot of steps we haven't even talked about. I think we don't even know necessarily all of those steps right now, but I do think we need time to figure that out. And realistically, a timeline, I think, would allow us to put those pieces in place to reach the end goal of having a sustainability plan adopted. Mr. Schultz?
I believe I'm sorry.
No, Mr. Epps. Yeah, go ahead.
The general goal makes sense to me. I would propose that instead of modifying the policy to have a short-term interim goal like that, since it already has a date of June 30th, meaning, technically it's not, we need to update it before June 30th, but we don't necessarily need to update it in 2 months. Maybe we could identify that timeline with the intent that updating the policy to reflect that time, like that's the goal, is updating this policy to reflect an accurate and maybe more detailed series of steps and procedures. For
saying retaining the June 30th, 2022 date, or are you saying putting together a timeline that would walk us towards a sustainability plan at some point?
I'm suggesting that we table this policy for 2 more months, and in those 2 months, identify the timeline that you're proposing and have the proposed policy change be the outcome of that timeline. So in other words, we are functionally not, we're not going to adopt a sustainability plan on June 30th, but since it takes 2 months anyway to update a policy, rather than update the policy to say we're going to change the June 30th goal, let's just do that and then have the change process begin in April, or next month. We revisit it for another first read, maybe with the language around what an updated timeline could look like.
So I think procedurally, though, that would require either we pull this policy off of the table as a first read, and we then bring back the discussion either to a facilities meeting or a small board group to really talk about how to put that, both timeline and sustainability plan together. And then to the extent that we need to modify this policy going forward, we can do that within the next couple of months and then bring that around through the policy review process again.
Yes, that is what I thank you for putting it better than I was. I think that's what I'm suggesting. I would support that.
Okay. Mr. Bordeaux Williams?
I'll be quick because I know Mr. Epps has some other commentary, but I do agree with your proposal, Julie, again, as mentioned, and just want to add to the conversation that in place of the aforementioned sustainability committee, which we have not presented some formal assignments for. I do think the appropriate place is with the facilities committee. And, you know, again, as co-chair of that committee, you know, welcome the opportunity for that to be on the agenda for one of the next 2 upcoming facilities committee meetings, preferably not the one that is scheduled for this Tuesday, as I will not be present. But again, you know, not to slow down district business. I do think that, again, at least in the essence of being able to meet the timeline that Mr. Schultz specified, and be in advance of the before June 30th revision of the policy, the next 2 upcoming facilities committee meetings, I think, would be a good place to have that conversation. And we'll work toward that again in my role as co-chair. But yes, agree with your recommendation regarding you know, our path forward.
Okay, I want to be mindful of the time. It's about 6:31. So again, I'm just going to restate what I think I'm hearing is that the policy committee is recommending withdrawing off of the agenda policy in AR 823, at least for a couple of months, to allow some further discussion by the facilities committee to come up with a plan or timeline to establish a sustainability plan. To the extent that that then would warrant any changes, which it would, to the June 30th, 22 date, we would bring this policy back to the policy committee, potentially in, you know, April, for further review. Is everyone amenable to that?
Is this, Mr. Diazio, would somebody make a motion to table this agenda item? Or is that not necessary in a committee meeting?
We just sort of put this on here as a discussion item, so we won't move this forward to the full board meeting. And what I'll do is Ms. Jackson and I maintain like a list of draft agendas for the remaining portion of the year. We'll just list this. I'll just move it to April just so that we don't forget about it.
Great.
And then we can always adjust as we get closer to that date if we need to.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a more realistic timeframe.
Okay, great.
Great. Mr. Burdell Williams?
I agree as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to have my hand up.
Oh, that's okay. And the last thing on the agenda is...
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Epps.
Sorry for the interruption. I wanted to circle back to my question before we move forward. It is related to 823. Under the purpose, that last sentence, sort of, this may take the form of periodic renewal, sustainability audits, other initiatives, and so forth. Have we considered, or I guess this is still draft mode, but would like to consider what it would look like to require measurement of progress and public reporting of that progress?
So I think right now, Mr. Epps, I think if we're going to withdraw this or table this until April, probably would be appropriate to, you know, think about if that is additional placeholder language for this policy, because I'm assuming there's going to be many more additional changes to this policy itself in April. So if you wanted to kind of have that language in there or thought in there as a placeholder when we bring it back, I think this would be appropriate to include that now.
If I heard you correctly, I would appreciate coming back. What you said is when we come back to it, having that language in there already.
Okay.
Correct. I understood you correctly.
Yes, you did.
And not waiting until April. Yes, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's better to capture it now, knowing that we're not going to move this forward probably until April, but at least we won't lose the thought.
I think it's also a good conversation to have at facilities when you have the discussion. I think it's a perfectly good place to do that.
Okay.
Point of information.
Sure.
The policy, we would need to have it in the policy, and then this is a question, would we need to have that in the policy in order to, like, we could have the conversations if we wanted to, but does it need to be in the policy in order for that to actually happen at the facilities level?
So the facilities committee can have any discussion, and then based on what the facilities committee recommends, we can then make changes to the policy in anticipation of presenting a revised policy to this committee at a later point in the year.
Yeah, I think we're going to get a very full conversation at the facilities committee meeting about additional considerations that we'll need to kind of, incorporate into this policy when it comes back to the committee for review. Okay. Again, being mindful of time, the last agenda item, it's not really an agenda item, but it's a point of discussion, is we have basically a TBD for the time for the February meeting and actually future meetings of the policy committee. If you recall, we had proposed changing the time from 8 o'clock until 5 o'clock with the thought we would have more community participation. Have since learned that Dr. Smith is not available at the 5 o'clock time. So as we discuss probably many policies in the policy committee that require her input, we would not have real-time input from her during the meeting. With that in mind, there was a recommendation that we retain the 8 o'clock start time for the policy committee for the remainder of this year. And then going forward in the fall, consider changing the time. And what Mr. Epps and I had discussed was making that time 7 p.m. as a start time versus 5 p.m., consistent with the start time of our other committee meetings. And Mr. Schultz, I know I see you kind of, I see your trepidation with that approach. I'm going to give you an opportunity to speak, but that, again, after we had publicly stated we were moving the time back, those were considerations, additional considerations that were brought to our attention as co-chairs. And I thought it was important that we have this discussion as a committee because, we do need folks at the meeting and we both want public participation, but we also need to have administrative participation meaningful during the meeting as well. So, Mr. Schultz?
My question, yeah, and that makes sense. I'm curious why we wouldn't be able to just move it to 7 this year. Why wait until next year to move to the 7 o'clock time?
That's a very good question. I'm going to probably defer to Ms. Jackson and Dr. Scriven. My understanding is that Dr. Smith is taking a class right now and is not available on Wednesday evenings.
Yeah, that is correct, Madam Chair. And in fairness to the administration, I mean, we know we operate at the discretion of the board in terms of those time mandates, but I need her as an active participant. And right now, that's not a reality. When we first heard of the time change, we put that out there from the very beginning that it would be a conflict. I do not want to put her under any type of duress on trying to reschedule something which she just can't reschedule. So that is why we were considering tabling this till the remainder of the year and potentially revisiting a different time that was more amenable. So hopefully that answers your question, Mr. Schultz.
Yes, it does.
And I think that, again, we have some really great discussions during the policy committee meeting. Dr. Smith is an integral part of these discussions because many of the policies, as we know, apply to her area of expertise. Not having her be able to provide real-time input during the meetings really can possibly delay moving some of the policies forward, which we obviously don't want to do. I think it's an opportunity that we can revisit kind of retaining the 7 p.m. start time for all board meetings. I think it would do two things. It would allow for active participation from administration, knowing that time in advance, as well as I think the public is used to having 7 p.m. start times for all of our committee meetings, and hopefully would also facilitate more public participation as well.
Just one board member in support of the consistency of the 7 p.m. start time. I think there's a lot to be said about that, right? Very many of us in the community are set on our our set schedules. And I think knowing 7 p.m. is generally board time. I know it doesn't, it's not just me because I'm on the board,
Tuesdays.
but yeah, it is right. Typically Tuesdays, correct. And I think just like the consistency of the timing, I think would, be a good measure to kind of ensure that we could get additional community participation in addition to administration as well.
Mhm. So is everybody comfortable? We'll have to go back out and make a, public announcement of the change at the legislative meeting. But is everyone comfortable continuing with the 8 o'clock start time for policy until June, and then moving to a 7 p.m. start time starting in August? And I, also I'm asking that of administration, if that 7 p.m. start time is a conflict for anyone. Mr. Schultz.
And I appreciate that this is the proposed plan, and I won't ask a question beyond this, but would Tuesday, we don't have a board meeting on the fourth Tuesdays of the month. And I wondered if 7 p.m. on Tuesday might actually fit the pattern more effectively anyway, and potentially avoid the conflict. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. And really for me and you, Dan, we'll have a conflict going forward on this Wednesday because of another board commitment as well. So we don't have to make that decision tonight. I think the one decision that's in front of us is retaining the 8 a.m. start time for the Wednesdays, except for the dates that were the third Wednesday, as noted by Ms. Jackson in the calendar for the policy committee.
And sorry, to clarify, actually, my question is for this year, if there was no conflict for this year, making it Tuesdays starting February is that's the question. If the answer is we know, or we would really just rather stick with this 8 for this year, and that buys us several months to figure out, that's fine. I just wanted to raise it.
I'm going to defer to administration. Tuesday at 7 for me is better, but that's just me.
I would need to circle back to the administrative team and see if that's feasible.
Okay.
And then I can follow.
Yeah, we have time, obviously. Our next meeting is not till February the 16th, but
Right.
I think we'll need to have a recommendation to provide to the rest of the board as well before the legislative meeting.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
For what I'm comfortable with, especially after looking into whether Tuesday would work, my preference would be Tuesday as well, but I will support whatever administration yields.
And so we're looking at possibly the fourth Tuesday of each month. Is that what we're talking? Okay.
Yes. And I think, Ms. Jackson, the other question that was raised was whether we should continue having a June policy committee meeting. And Zachary and I did talk about that and felt, as a recommendation back to the committee, we wanted to retain the June meeting. We have a lot of work to be done on the policy side. And, we again could change that June meeting to maybe the third Tuesday or Wednesday, wherever we land, so afford folks an opportunity to take scheduled vacation in June.
Yeah, that was the concern. Our principals, as you know, once the teachers are gone, the principals then have that opportunity to start scheduling their vacations. And all of our administrators. So sometimes they conflict with having to attend policy meetings or any meetings other than the ones that Dr. Scriven, we usually have one meeting for all administrators, kind of just to go over the whole year. And after that, they can make they can put in their request for vacation. So that was the concern about having the June meeting. And then I had spoken with Ed. I know he had to jump off, and he was saying several other districts do that. So that's why that was proposed. But I'm fine if we have it on an earlier day in June. I don't know. I would have to look at the calendar because I know we have the second Tuesday is the board meeting. So
right, and I think we were suggesting possibly the third Tuesday, which would coincide with kind of the closing of school. And should not, should not interfere with anyone's vacation time, because I don't think anybody's taking vacation before school ends, but they could be.
We
So,
wouldn't approve it, so.
so why don't we do this? I know it's getting late and I have another actually meeting to jump off for at 7 as well. If we could have administration come back with a recommendation to the policy committee, taking in consideration either 2 options, or maybe there are more, 8 o'clock, retain that until the end of this school year and move to 7 o'clock start time in the fall. Or alternatively, looking at Tuesday, the 3rd Tuesday as a meeting, no, I guess it would be the 4th Tuesday
Mhm.
for policy committee at 7, going forward, starting in February. And then retaining the June meeting, but looking at a different date, either on where we settle for Tuesday or Wednesday for June.
Okay, we can do that.
Okay. And then we can circle back. We'll, float that out to the committee members.
We'll do.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Zachary Epps.
Okay.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Hess.
Charles Burdell Williams.
Great. I have a second. All those in favor say no. No. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. You guys have a great evening.